Hi everybody, Professor Breckeisen here, and in this video I'm going to take you through my personal story structure called the Hexodus. It is a 6-part story structure that I've been devising for a while, and I'd like you to learn it so that we can have some common things that we can talk about when we're talking about story analysis. Now, one of the things I want to preface with this is that it's not meant to be 100% for every film that exists out there. And sometimes everything we're going to talk about doesn't always cover a film 100%, but it is a theory that covers most films and most of those films. Yes, you're going to find a lot of examples that that are not part of the Hexodus or don't apply to the Hexodus, and that's perfectly fine. That's what art is supposed to be. But this is a large portion of our commercial films that we're going to look at. So let's go to the digital blackboard and learn a little bit more about the Hexodus. All right, so now we're here inside my studio, and we're going to look at the Hexodus and how this works, and kind of learn about this theory a little bit more. So let me go ahead and get myself all situated here with my swatches and everything, and let's get started. So the main thing that we need to remember, like I said before, is that when we're looking at story, at least when we're looking at 3-act structure story, the Hexodus story, is that we are going to be working inside of that container. And that container, like I mentioned before, is that 3-act structure. So if I here, I'm just put these lines down like that, it's dividing ourselves into what we call Act 1, Act 2, and then Act 3. Okay? And each one of these acts have a specific purpose and function within our story. Now, each one of these 3 acts is going to contain 2 major sections of the Hexodus. And so that's what we're going to go through right now. I'm going to describe this process using 2 films that I find very enjoyable to me. Hopefully you've seen them. They're pretty universal. One's a little bit older. One's kind of older, but hopefully everyone has seen them before. And then you can always look at other ones later on as I come out with other videos analyzing those films. With the first one we're going to look at is Back to the Future, and then we're also going to look at Gladiator as we go through this process. So with Act 1, the important thing is that we understand that this is our beginning of our story. We're setting up all the different parameters. We're setting up all the different genre tropes or whatever it is that we're going to be setting up in this world. This is the start of that film, and it doesn't matter what genre we're talking about or what time period or any of that other stuff that we're talking about. Act 1 is going to have a specific purpose. Act 1 is all about what I call the status quo. That means we're trying to give the audience an understanding of what the universe is for our story in the beginning. Now, it can be very similar to real life. Manchester by the Sea, for example, is a good story that doesn't really take a whole lot of explanation for us to understand what the universe is. But if we watch something like Avatar, we're going to have to invest a little bit into what that universe is all about, what the color schemes are, what a lot of the concepts that are not that might be foreign to us as people that live on Earth and not out there in the middle of space would have to know. But that status quo is going to get defined somehow. And that's going to be done usually through some type of exposition or some series of events or a sequence that kind of brings that to life. Some are more boring than others, and being creative in that exposition is important. Within that exposition, we're going to talk about our protagonist. And I don't like to use the term protagonist, although I have no problem with it. But for this theory, I'm going to use a different word. And that word we're going to call this person the Who. The Who is the person that this story is about. Now, that is typically one person. Okay? We might find that like there's some stories that have a cast of characters, or maybe it's like a buddy characters, 2 friends or something. Dumb and Dumber is a really good example of a story that has more than one perceived main character, and a lot of people look at it that way. But what I want to focus on is not so much the perceived main characters, but the person that's driving the story, the person that's making the decisions, and most importantly, the person who throughout this story is going to have an arc. And typically, that's going to be one person regardless of how many cast of characters we have in that story. For Dumb and Dumber, it was Jim Carrey's character. Lloyd that was going through the entire process. If he had never seen the briefcase and made the decision to go to Aspen, then Jeff Daniels' character would still be driving that big shaggy dog to today probably. So that's who the Who is. So we're going to identify what the main character is. And that character is our protagonist, the one that goes through that journey. Now, we need to get him a little bit invested into who this person is. So we're going to have to establish two things about this Who. We're going to need to know their need and their want. And yes, I understand that we know what these things are, right? We've all been in those situations before where we're like, but I need this thing, just to find out that that's really a want. Then there is, Maslow's hierarchy of needs does exist. But when we talk about story, we're going to define these a little bit different. We're going to make a different container for what a need is and for what a want is. A need in story revolves around one of three things. And they all start with the letter L. It's either going to be love, loyalty, or loot. Either that character has something that they're trying to obtain, either a relationship of some sort, some camaraderie of some sort, or an object of some sort. The majority of movies that we watch are going to focus around, at least in this early initial stage, relationships of some kind. So most of the movies we're going to watch are love stories. There are a few that are going to be about loyalty. Usually those are going to be military-style movies or things with purpose and like an agenda in that way, if you will, if that's a good word for that. And then less common are going to be loot movies. And those are going to be the movies where somebody wants to just obtain something, and that's really the only motivation that they have. There might be a case for movies that only focus on life. But for the most part, in a feature film, that's not going to necessarily be the case. Maybe in a short that will. A movie like Gravity, on the other hand, is a good candidate for this. At the beginning of this film, because there is some issues with this film as far as the Hexodus goes. It doesn't fit perfectly with this, which is just as fine as anything else, because it's just a theory about the stories that fit this model. But that one doesn't fit this model very well, and it's not till later on in the movie that we actually realize what her need is. And in the beginning, it's just really to survive. So that's a life one. But we can analyze that a little bit differently later. The want is what the character does in order to obtain their need. And this can be very ambiguous. It can be varied from movie to movie. It can be super obvious. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to go for is we want to have something that the audience can relate to. Now, the reason why the main character has a need of love, loyalty, and loot is because that's what you and I have. We are constantly trying to obtain some kind of relationship or maintain some kind of relationship, some kind of ideal or some loyalty in our lives, or a thing that we're looking for. So when it comes to identifying with this main character, knowing what they need or identifying what they need, love, loyalty, or loot, is very important. Now, the want can be something very different than what you and I want to satisfy that main need. You might be in a place in your life right now where your need for love comes from wanting a family member to accept you. Or maybe your need for love is to find a significant other. Or maybe to repair a relationship with somebody. Or to find a dog. There's a lot of different things that we need that we want to satisfy that love. But at the end of the day, we understand, even if we don't know what somebody else is looking for to satisfy that need, we know what it means to satisfy that need. So when we're watching Gladiator, which we're going to analyze in a minute, and his need is love, and you might be confused by that because you've seen that movie and you're like, that's not a love story. But it is. The way that he's going to satisfy that need of love is because he wants to go back to his family. And a lot of us have that idea. We know what family means. If we have a traditional family, we know what that feels like. If we have a non-traditional family, but we have people that we consider our family, we know the importance of having love in our life in the form of a family. So we might not know what it means to be a soldier that has been separated from our family for a long time in the middle of Europe hundreds of years ago. We don't have that idea at all. So I can't say that I know exactly how Maximus feels. but I can say I know how he feels because I know his overall goal there is love, and I've had that before. Now, Brokeback Mountain, obviously another love story, right? And many of us might have never experienced or had to struggle with a world of unacceptance in a same-sex environment. But we can watch that movie still and understand the emotions that those two characters are going through as they're trying to explore that world and to satisfy their need for love. So we don't have to necessarily experience everything that our characters are experiencing, but we need to understand what they're going for on that big fundamental level. Now, this is an interesting part of the story, and I'm spending a whole lot of time on this. But realistically, as far as page count goes and time on the screen, this is very insignificant. There's not a whole lot of time, and probably more often than not, once we get into the movie a little bit more, we completely forget about this on a very front brain cognitive level. It might be kind of in the back of our brain and something that we're still thinking about, but there's a whole lot of other stuff that's happening that's way more important than what this seems, that's grabbing our attention. So, in the movie Back to the Future, Marty McFly is our who. That's the person that we're following in this story. His need is what? Can you think of it? Do you know what it is? You've seen this movie, probably. It's a pretty fun one. But it's also love. His need is love in this movie. And some of you are like, whoa, that does not make any sense. And then some of you are going like, oh yeah, obviously because of his family. Nope, has nothing to do with his family. That's later on in the movie. I'm talking about at the beginning of this movie. At the beginning of this movie, Marty McFly has a need that he wants to satisfy of love. And that want is by going up to the mountains with his girlfriend that weekend. And what he needs from his dad is the car to be able to do that. And the beginning of that whole entire movie is about him doing that. And some of you went, oh yeah, I do remember that now. And some of you are still like, I've seen this 8 times and I don't know what he's talking about. So there is a level where this gets kind of pushed to the side a little bit, but it's important that it's there because when you first watched that film, not knowing what you know now, you needed something to hook you into that character, and those are the moments that do that. Now, it's fine to watch a movie about a character that needs something, and they're going after what they need, which is their want, but that doesn't make much of a story. So there's going to be a moment here where this gets absolutely stopped. And that's going to get stopped by what I call the problem of our story. Now, a problem is a particular word. This means that the character does not have the knowledge, the ability, or the tools to overcome this problem. We all know that there's a difference between the word problem and obstacle. And if you're to think about it, probably problem is more significant than an obstacle. An obstacle is something that our character does have the knowledge, the tools, or the ability to overcome. An obstacle might be as we're running away from some KGB officers. We're in the CIA and we're running away from KGB officers, running through all downtown Moscow, maybe through the Red Square, right? And all of a sudden there's this big group of people. That's an obstacle, but our main character can easily navigate and swim through those people, pushing people aside, whatever he needs to do. Eventually he's going to get to a low brick wall that's about 3 feet high. Well, that's easy to get over. That's just an obstacle, not a problem. Right? As he gets to a vehicle, jumps into that vehicle, doesn't have the keys, but he knows that the person that owns this vehicle hides him up in the sun visor, which is a typical trope that you'll see inside movies. He had the knowledge to look up there. So he has the ability and the knowledge and the tools to be able to be successful. As he's running, all of a sudden, boom, he runs into the middle of Phoenix and or Arizona, runs real close, gets to the edge of the Grand Canyon, and now he's stuck. That's a problem, because we don't have the tools, knowledge, or the ability to overcome that. We can give those to our main character very easily. Super secret spy plane flies over, drops down a jetpack. Now he's got a tool. Right? We find out in this moment that this person has been injected with a super serum, and he doesn't know it yet, but he's got superpowers and he can jump over it. Now he's got the ability. Or Indiana Jones style, he just kind of looks to the side like this and says, oh, there's a bridge right here, I'll just walk across. Now he has the knowledge. So that's really the difference here. Now, the problem is going to come into play here in the beginning of this first act, and they're going to stop our main character from getting what they want. Typically, this problem is shown in the form of a person. This is my shorthand from when I was in undergrad days of a person. When I was writing down notes, I didn't know if a Kuleshov was a piece of film equipment, or a person. And so I had to learn real quick to put a little person next to there when I figured it out with those clues. So when I went back, I wasn't talking about a Kuleshov lens, which doesn't exist. That would be pretty cool, though. So typically, our problem is going to come in the form of a person. And that is what we traditionally would call our antagonist. But the reason I call them a problem is because the character doesn't have the tools, ability, or the knowledge to overcome them. And what they do is they end up coming up here and destroying the ability for our character to get what they want. And so they can't satisfy what they need. Now, we took a long time to explain this, because this is super important that we engage the audience into being able to root for our characters, to understand the environment that they're in, and understand at least these two major players. There's a lot of other players that get put into the mix here with mentors and gatekeepers and all these other people that you can learn if you study Joseph Campbell and other authors. But for the most part, we're going to focus on this because we want to connect our audience to these people. This could take maybe 5 pages, 10 pages. It's not a whole lot of time. We're looking at about 10% of our film takes place here in this first act. And that's the status quo world. Okay? This all makes up part 1, I call Hex 1, of the Hexodus theory. Part 2, or Hex 2, is going to be what I call the thrust 2. Boom. Something that's going to throw us into the second act. I don't want to focus on this just yet. I want to look at what the second act is. The second act is where all the excitement and all the awesomeness that we're going to write into our movie gets put into. This act is where we feel that when you're coming up with your story and you're like, what if my character had this, or what if my character did that, what if my character this? So I call this the what if. We are not starting the what if in Act 1. We are starting that in Act 2. We've established the normals, we've established the status quo, then we get them into that what if world. That speaks very highly to us. As people who watch film, we love this what if world. You're involved in what ifs all the time. What if he fell in love with me? What if I had that car? What if I lived in this location? What if I had a film degree? You are in your second act right now as a student. And that is very exciting and a whole lot of fun. And you can look back at your status quo and you can see what brought you to this moment. This Act 2 is also, I call this the upside down world. And I'm going to draw these two little arrows right here, showing that we're going to turn this world upside down on us. This is because at some level, either very greatly or very small, we are going to show our main character, the who, outside of their element. It could be subtle. It could be they go from being a single father to being in a relationship. That's an upside down world, very common upside down world in a lot of people's lives. It's not super drastic. It could also be very drastic. We can be super nerdy student inside of high school, all of a sudden gets injected with a super serum and whoosh, now they're a superhero. That's a big upside down world. The movie Legally Blonde comes to mind. Elle is, she has a need for love, right? She wants her boyfriend. Her boyfriend moves away to college. She decides to follow her upside down world. The writers of this did not take her from LA to Riverside, which is basically the same place. They didn't take her from LA to Las Vegas or from LA to San Diego. What they decided to do was take her world, full of bubbly California goodness, chihuahuas and convertibles, mini skirts and hair product, turn that way upside down and threw her inside of the least likely place like that, which is Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Harvard. She is way out of her element. That is an extremely upside down world. In order for us to get our character to this upside down world, we got to go back here to this H2, this Hex 2. and that's the thrust. The thrust is now going to be an opportunity that our character has to either go into that world deliberately or to be kidnapped. For Elle in Legally Blonde, she decided to get a plane ticket and get on the plane and go. She made that decision to travel there herself. Gladiator, on the other hand, when Maximus goes to his family who's just been murdered by Commodus, who's the problem, who stops him from getting what he wants, he is now ripped into slavery, brought down to Africa, and is now a gladiatorial combatant. So he gets absolutely kidnapped into his world. Now, Marty McFly, what is his? Does he get kidnapped? Does he make the choice? He jumps into that DeLorean and he drives off and he goes back into the past. You might argue that he made the decision to go in that DeLorean, but I would argue that he was still kidnapped, because he did not intend to hit the flux capacitor, set up all the things, and go into the past. So it's kind of a combination of both, which is a whole lot of fun. So in the Act 1, you've got the status quo setting up the need and the want of the main character, the problem that's going to stop him. Hex 2 is that thrust, which is either kidnapping or being having a choice to go into Act 2, and now we're inside of Act 2. So what is this act all about? Well, first of all, we need to give ourselves a new problem. Now, why'd I call that a new problem? Because the character should not have the tools, knowledge, or the ability to overcome it. But this is the problem that now exists inside of this upside-down world. This is the reason why the what if this normal person had this extraordinary problem in an environment that they're not used to? That's your fun in games of that story. So I call this area here, as the character is trying to obtain their new problem or solve their new problem, I call it the magic spoon of happiness. They're out to get that magic spoon of happiness that's going to make them return back to their status quo world. In order for them to obtain this magic spoon of happiness, they know it's out there, they know they need to get it. We're going to have to follow with them through some escalating conflicts. And that's when we're going to see this kind of action happen throughout this whole entire act. As we go through, things get more and more challenging, more and more difficult. The stakes get raised. Our fear for life and danger and losing what they want increases. And you can't do this backwards, else you're going to have a boring movie for obvious reasons. But if at the end here, the main character is supposed to fight this dragon, but you put that dragon at the beginning and he overcomes the dragon, and then later on you have him squishing these little ants towards the end of that second act, it's not going to have the same feel as if we started with the ants and ended with the dragon. And I think that's pretty obvious. But at this point right here, these are where we start to see our obstacles. And obstacles are things that our character has, maybe not right away, but will have easy access to the tools, knowledge, and ability to overcome. Sequence happens, tools, knowledge, ability, overcome it. Another sequence happen, overcome it. Another sequence, overcome it. Another sequence. All the way building up to this grand finale moment in the second act where they can finally now obtain the solution to their new problem. And as they travel through this world, they come up to the Cave of Wonders. And inside that Cave of Wonders lives the chest of magical possibilities. And they go in there and they open up this chest, and one of two things is going to happen. Either that magic spoon is there and they are victorious, or it's not and they have been defeated. But we can't end our movie here. We can't say, oh, we're defeated, end credits, sad ending. And we can't end the movie if we find the magic spoon of happiness and go, oh, happy ending. That's because we have to go all the way back to the Act 1 problem, and we need to make sure that we address that. So in order for this to not feel like a complete part of the story, it's going to be false. That spoon is there, but it doesn't work. At least not the way it's supposed to. Or opens up the chest, and darn, it's not there, but not all hope is lost. Typically at this point, though, is where we start to see that the character loses everything. Blake Schneider calls this the dark night of the soul. And as they spiral out of control down into nothing, we start to see the mentors are leaving, the B-story love interest is no longer there, all the allies are either dead or gone. Whatever ability or tool that this character has been able to obtain to get through this second act has been removed from them and from some reason, and they are now back to their, what I call their naked self, which means their self from that status quo world, and now they're stuck. But they're not completely done yet. So, a lot of what we're talking about here is part of the Hex 3. We're looking at the new problem, we're looking at these rising conflicts, and then we're looking at that magic spoon of happiness inside that chest. That's all part of the Hex 3. Hex 4 revolves around this false victory, false defeat, and then eventually down to what I call the thrust to 3, which is going to lead us into our third act. Unlike the thrust to 2, most often this is going to be a deliberate decision. The character has now gone through everything, learned something new, obtained great things, gone through this entire upside down world, and is now ready to go back and face the original problem that they had in the very beginning of this film to overcome whatever is involved there. So, most of the time it's going to be a decision. They're going to make the decision to go to the Enchanted Under the Sea dance. They're going to make the decision to go to the court, to the debate. They're going to make the decision to enter into the dungeon and fight the bad guy. Sometimes, though, it is another kidnapping. And we'll see that with Gladiator. It's kind of a little bit of both, again. And that makes from really good movies. Act 3 is our last act here. And that's where we get our resolution. I don't know if that's very easily legible there, but that says resolution. And the first part of this is that they are going to fight, and they're going to have their main conflict in this area right here. Boom. The major conflict that they're going to have. And who is this conflict with? Let's go back to Act 1. Typically, it's that character that we've seen in the beginning, that problem. But now, our main character is going to be able to fight this person or overcome them. Because somewhere in that second act, they have either learned some ability, were given some tool, or were given the knowledge in order to overcome this person now. That's the arc. The arc has now been made. They were deficient and they didn't have that in the very beginning. And then somewhere through that process, they learned or obtained what they needed. So now they can return back to this final conflict, this major conflict here, and they can have that fight. This is going to end in some kind of ending, and it's either going to be a happy ending or it's going to be a sad ending. And more likely than not, especially with American movies, we're talking about a happy ending. They get what they want, status quo gets restored, but they also satisfy their need. Now, as far as our story goes, 70% of our time is going to be spent here inside of the second act, or about. Okay? And another 10% or so is going to be spent here in the final act. Now, I know that that doesn't add up to 100%, and I do that deliberately because I don't want you to think that these numbers are actually true. So it's around 10%, probably a little bit more in the beginning, around 70%, give or take, around 10%, maybe even less in the third act. We like to keep the third act a lot less. We want to get people out of the theater, right? We want to move them. We want to move their booties out of the chair so we can get new booties in there with more salty snacks and more sugary drinks. But this is basically that setup. And in Act 3, the Hex 4 or Hex 5 is that major or that final conflict, and Hex 6 is that resolution. So I'm going to run this down just a little bit more one last time, kind of really fast. Okay? Act 1. That's going to be our Hex 1. Hex 1 of Act 1. We are going to establish the status quo. We're going to give the audience a little bit of understanding of what's going on in this story. We're going to introduce the main character, the Who. We're going to give them their need, which most likely is going to be love, but it can be loyalty, loot, and sometimes life, especially if it's a shorter film. We're going to demonstrate to the audience how they're going to get and satisfy that need, because the audience already understands it, but they might not know exactly how this character is going to do it, so we're going to establish that through their want. Through this want, we're going to show all the ways in which they're going to try to get it. And they're always going to be unsuccessful. And eventually they're going to get to that last final resort, and they can't do anything about it because they get stopped by that problem, who happens to be our antagonist. Hex 2, now is going to be our thrust. And either they're kidnapped or they make the choice, that's a C, to go into that second act. There, we're going to have to set up a whole new what-if world. We're going to have to establish new rules. We're going to have to give the audience an idea of what this world is and why it's so different from before. And importantly, we're going to eventually get to that new problem. And this is where the fun is of this whole entire story, where we're going to spend most of the time, and probably the main reason why you wanted to tell this story. We're going to identify what the character needs to get in order to win again. That's the magic spoon of happiness. And then we're going to bring them through a series of obstacles that accelerate and become harder and more difficult and threaten the character in some way to lose what they're going after until eventually they get to that magic spoon or that magic chest. At that point... Sorry, let me get this back to here. At that point, we're going to go back to another thrust in our Hex 4. And this thrust is now usually a choice, but it doesn't have to, as they go in and say, I am going to now fight this main character. Schneider calls this going in to storm the castle and going into that final battle. And the reason why they decided to do this thrust is because they found out that there was nothing inside that chest that could work, or it wasn't there, because either it was there, but it was false, or it wasn't, but that doesn't mean that they're done. And now they go in and they have this final conflict. And the final conflict happens between, it's our resolution in this act, final conflict or a major conflict. I'm going to call that final conflict because I do have another one that's called major conflict, so I'm going to change that to that name. And that's going to be with this who from the very beginning. And if you notice now right here that what I just made, let me make this a little bit larger, that is we have a problem that eventually leads to fighting that problem here in the main end. That's where we have our arc of our story. And that arc is what allows us to stay focused on our character and see them get through this and actually win. Eventually, what we're going to do is we're going to see that they're going to either overcome, sorry about this, I have my touch turned on and it keeps doing that, that we're going to find that they have this kind of conflict and our character is either going to win or lose, but 9 times out of 10, maybe even more, happy ending for our stories, unless you're in France or you're trying to do something kind of artsy. It's kind of a joke. You don't have to be, it doesn't have to be French. They have happy endings too. And that is the 6 parts of the Hexodus. Now let's look and see how this works with a show like Back to the Future. In Back to the Future, we have a main character. And that main character is played by Marty McFly. Here, I'm going to do something real quick. I'm going to make an adjustment here, and I'm going to bring down, oops, wrong way, my background just a little bit so that these pop out just a little bit more. So in our first act there, Marty McFly, what does he need? He needs love in the form of going out with his girlfriend, Jennifer. Okay? Who's the problem in this story? Biff! He wrecks the car! McFly, why didn't you tell me that there was a blind spot in the mirror as he's chugging his beer, right? So that ends up causing a problem for Marty. Marty then makes the decision, after Doc gets blown away by terrorists, to get inside the car, and he gets now thrust into that upside-down world. And boy, is it upside down. In the whole beginning of this movie, we see Marty McFly with his relationships. He doesn't get along well with his family, particularly his mom. They don't have a good relationship. Whoop, that changes in the second act, right? Now mom's relationship is quite different. We also see a lot of other changes that are happening in there as well. In order for Marty to get back, he needs to meet Doc and give him the plans or have him help him come up with the flux capacitor, because he's going to fall down and he hit his head that day. We have a series of events like meeting Doc, convincing his dad that he needs to kind of become a little bit more aggressive, and eventually leading to the clock tower being struck and allowing him to go home. On top of all that, we need to make sure that Marty McFly gets to the dance and gets his parents back together. Eventually, that doesn't really work out. He starts to lose, he starts to be disappeared. his dad gets beat up by Biff, and now all is lost. But eventually, because of this whole problem here, they're going to get together. The parents are going to end up kissing at the dance, and we're going to have a resolution here where Marty McFly gets to finally get inside of a car really close to his girlfriend like he wanted to in the very beginning. And not only that, but we get some sweet comeuppance with the bad guy. The problem in the beginning now is the super nerd that is washing their car for him. So that's an example of Back to the Future and how well that works. That's a lot of fun. Let's look at Gladiator. Who's our main character in Gladiator? Well, it's Maximus. And who is Maximus at the beginning of this film? He's a general. Not only is he a general, but eventually he's going to be asked by Caesar himself to become the Caesar. Become the top of the food chain. Okay? He doesn't necessarily want this. What does Maximus want? He needs love in the form of his family. He wants to go home. We might miss that a little bit, but if you go and rewatch this film, it doesn't stop. He talks for lengths. The first thing we see is his hand over the wheat. He's a farmer. He reaches down, grabs dirt, smells it. That smell means something to a farmer. He has his battle. Everything happens. Then Caesar comes to him and says, "What can I do for you?" He goes, "I want to go home." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, home. I got a better idea for you. Tell me about your home," he says first. And he talks about his wife and her hair that's black, but it's really brown, and his kid. Loves horses so much that he wants to be a pony. I guess that's the original Brony right there. But someone else has other plans for him, and that's Commodus. And there's even a scene where Maximus goes into the tent and says what he wants. He goes, "When your dad releases me, I intend to go home." And he goes, "Well, don't get too comfortable. I might call upon you again." In order to create the denial moment, Commodus kills Maximus's family. He has no way for him to recover from that. That's a problem. He does not have the tools, knowledge, or ability to be with his family now. In his haste, he becomes kidnapped and brought into gladiatorial combat in Africa. While he's there, he learns of his new position, but he also gets acquainted with the senators who said that they can free him, send him out so that he can reclaim his army, bring his army in, take over Commodus, and become essentially the emperor. But he promises to give rule back to the Senate, back to the people. They believe him, and that's what we're doing. But in order to get there, we're going to see more and more conflict, more and more battles. Things get more and more challenging as we go through. Eventually, leading to that moment where he can leave, but he gets recaptured again. This is the false victory, false defeat right here, where his mentor dies. This is the person that walked him through this process, who was once a free person, then was a gladiator, and now is a free person again. It's important with mentors that these mentors act both in the upside down world and in the status quo world. They're familiar with both, and that's why they're mentors. But it doesn't work out. Maximus is captured again. He's brought up and brought before Commodus, and he says this is where he was captured, and asks and says only a famous death will do, and he was going to fight him in the Colosseum. So Maximus doesn't necessarily make the choice because he got recaptured, but he makes a choice to follow through and have that final conflict. He has that final conflict with Commodus inside of the Colosseum, eventually killing him, but in the process also dying. And I don't care how macho and how hard your heart is, this is a sad moment, and a lot of people shed tears, and I do too when I watch this movie. And we might look at that and say, well, that is a sad ending. But it's not. That is not a sad ending. Because the reality is, on top of this, Maximus also gets to go back home and be with his family. And that's what he wanted from the very beginning. So this is a happy ending movie that has a very sad theme at the very end. And that's really how this works. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about questions. So now that we understand how the structure works, how do we keep people engaged with our story? How do we make sure that they want to watch our story rather than just get up and go do something else, pull out their phones, go make a sandwich? How do we keep them glued to our screen? We do that through the form of questions. Questions are some of the most important tools that we have as filmmakers. Now, from sequence to sequence, scene to scene, you're going to be peppering in a bunch of questions for your audience to ask. And they usually follow around two major principles or umbrellas of questions. Either one, what is happening, or two, what is going to happen. In a situation where we're watching a character as they're unfolding and discovering and looking at their world, we're watching going, I don't really know what's going on here. What is this? What's happening right now? I'm invested to know what this situation is. If it becomes too complicated, we might get frustrated. If it becomes too easy, we'll get bored. There's a happy middle there. There might be times when we catch up and go, ooh, now I know what's going on. And we might even foresee something in the future that's dangerous. And that's when we ask, oh no, what's going to happen? And we create these suspenseful moments. These can be very, very sit on the edge of your seat, you're scared, people are crying and shaking, covering their eyes kind of moments. Or just kind of like, okay, so where this is going, what's going to happen now? Cool, I understand. Or anywhere in between. When we're talking about our story development, however, we're also going to talk about questions, and there's 3 questions that we're going to really address. So let's go back to the chalkboard here, dividing up our world into our first act, our second act, and our third act. And if we recall, in our first act, we have the who's going after a need and a want, but a problem stops them. At that point, they thrust to their second act, where they have a new problem with escalating conflict until they reach that final thing that they're looking for, and either it's a final victory or a false victory or a false defeat. All is lost, and they get thrust eventually to Act 3. Here they're going to have their final conflict. Okay, again, probably with the antagonist, and that's going to lead down to their resolution, and most likely that is a happy ending. So what questions are posed because of these? In the first act, we're going to have a major question. In the second act, we're going to have a major question. And in this is getting annoying, I apologize, third act, we're going to have a major question. And these 3 questions are going to travel with our character and keep us engaged the whole time. In the first act, we have our problem, who is stopping our character from getting what they need and what they want. This is causing conflict. Another word for conflict, especially if it's a long drawn out conflict, is going to be drama. This is our major dramatic question. This major dramatic question is going to last until the entire film, because we start with this problem and then finally we're going to end in that third act with the character hopefully overcoming that problem. The second act provides us with 70% of our film. But I really apologize about this. My hand is getting sticky, and so it's causing this to happen. Remember, 70% of our film happens here, so most of this is where the action takes place. And the question comes from this new problem, and will they get it or not? Because all the action takes place here, this is now our major action question. That'll eventually lead here to the third act, where we have our final conflict, and that's going to be pretty obvious about what that question is going to be. Is our character going to overcome and win and have that happy ending or not? And that is our major conflict question. So we start with the major dramatic question, move into the major action question, move into the major conflict question. The main reason why you forget a lot of times about the major dramatic question is because that major action question really overtakes it, and that's really what we feel the movie's about, and that's what we remember a lot. Well, here's something that's pretty cool about all this. Our major dramatic question starts at the very, very, very beginning of this film, and it'll last until the very end. The major action question doesn't start until we have that thrust into the second act, and that's where this one will start, and it'll again last us until the final conflict, or until after the final conflict. And finally, the major conflict question is going to happen at the start of Act 3, and it's going to last until the end. Notice how each one of these start. It goes blue, yellow, red. It goes dramatic action and then conflict, but they usually end in order, in reverse order. Maximus, is he going to be with his family? Oh no, now he's a gladiatorial slave. Is he going to get out of this situation? Oh no, now he's got to fight Commodus. When we watch that film, he defeats Commodus, becomes emperor, therefore now he's saved, or he's brought out of that world, and then lastly he dies and he goes with his family. The interesting and fun thing is when it comes to our last answering of our questions, that's really, really quick. Happens sometimes within 5 minutes. Let's build up all these questions and answer them real quick. Get those booties out of the seats. We need to sell more tickets. And a lot of times it doesn't go out of order. If it does go out of order, it's going to look something like this. We're going to have our major dramatic question that goes like this. Then we're going to have our major action question that does something like this. And then maybe we're going to have then our major conflict question that looks like this. Or maybe what we're going to have is we're going to have our major dramatic question, major conflict question, or a major action question, then our major conflict question, like that. That's a couple of times, that's how I see poorly structured films and how they look. So essentially what's happening is in the major dramatic question era, we have a question here. Is this person going to get what they need and what they want? And eventually it's going to be answered right here. What we end up seeing is the conflict happen, but we don't necessarily care much of it after this point because we saw what the character got and they've actually satisfied their stuff. So this is going to feel like, boy, this conflict really takes a long time. Boy, this is really kind of boring. Why is this going on so long? And that is because you misplaced where your ending was. Similarly down here, if we end up seeing that somebody gets what they want by the end of the first act, then even before the major conflict happens, that's kind of like rolling credits right after the false victory, false defeat. That often happens when the second act, Magic Spoon of Happiness, is the same thing as the first act, Need and Want. At that point, we really don't care about the rest of this movie. Okay? This is why movies like the third Lord of the Rings were really challenging. By the end, we saw the ring was destroyed, the Fellowship was fine, everybody was perfect. Then we get like this 30-minute end sequence of people getting on boats saying goodbye to each other, and we're really bored. This doesn't mean your movie's bad, though. Django Unchained follows one of these structures. There's a big debate on Django, and if you're interested, you can listen to the podcast on story structure that's attached to this page, and you can listen to our analysis of that story structure. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening, because our main character gets flipped through it, we perceive that one character that is the main character ends up dying, and we start to follow another character. And basically that follows this structure right down here, where we don't really care anymore. We have our main character who's the dentist in the beginning. Then we find Django, and we have all the fun and games. The dentist dies, end of the movie. But then Django has to carry on his final conflict to answer his story as well. So it would have been better if we just didn't conclude the doctor in the beginning and just focused on Django's story, or if we reordered that story altogether. Now, a lot of people are going to say, no, Jamie Foxx is the main character of that story. But before he was selected, Will Smith was asked to play that character, and he said no, because he only plays the main character. So he saw it that way as well. Again, it doesn't mean it's a bad story. Django Unchained won Best Screenplay, Adapted Screenplay, or Original Screenplay that year. So it can still be a really good story. It just doesn't fit with this model. This model's not perfect. Doesn't mean everything's going to follow this, but this is a pretty good generic model. Students ask me all the time, Tommy, well, this doesn't fit this movie, it doesn't fit that movie. It's not going to fit every movie 100%. And it's not going to fit every 100% of all movies. It's just a theory that encompasses a lot of movies for a lot of what they are. And if you can talk on this level, you'll be pretty good. Last thing I want to show you is 2-act structures. They're becoming more and more popular. And a 2-act structure is going to look a little bit like this. I'll make my brush just a little bit bigger so we can see it. Remember, 3-act structure has this, then this, and then this. A 2-act structure is going to start in our second act. It is then going to proceed to a third act, but it's going to have a first act in it like this. And what we really miss is we miss all the beginning parts right here. We kind of cut all that off, and we don't see this. So let's say we have a story where a guy wants to get back together with his child, or a estranged child, right? The need is love, and the want is to get back with the child. As he's trying to do that, this big pandemic happens in the world and everyone becomes zombies. And now the upside down world is about watching him survive the zombies and what he's doing and try to travel and get to the girl. At the end of the day, he needs to have a conflict with a manufacturer of a vaccine and overcomes that person with the vaccine and ends up getting overcomes the doctor and wins. That's going to be what a standard 3-act story is going to look like here. Kind of forced into here. But what we're going to see is that we're not going to get the story of the child in the beginning of a 2-act structure. This film is going to start with our main character inside of a hole. Dark. It's going to start to fade in, and he's stuck inside this hole where people are pounding at the top, douche, 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 and eventually they're going to go away. He's going to come out, and we're going to learn through exposition and exploring that this is a zombie apocalypse. Through that experience, we're also going to learn and explore, and we're going to see a different world, or throughout his world, little clues that are going to show that the goal of this movie is for him to find his child. But we never see the beginning, the first act, where they have like the conflict and a person gets in the way, blah, 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 and leaves. Because as you can see here, the doctor that we're talking about was never part of this first act. The doctor didn't cause it. The doctor would be the problem. The problem comes from the first act. But the second act structure, the problem comes from the world of the second act. And in fact, it might be the magic spoon of happiness, but now it's a major conflict within that. So we're seeing this a little bit more and more frequently, especially with short films. Your short films, if anything's under 80 pages, it should follow this. If you want to do like something short, especially if it's under 20 pages. Just because you can get more crammed into the second act than you would. You don't have to worry about that first act. Just pepper it in there. Also, I'm thinking that as we go on through time, we don't need that second act anymore. There was a time when we didn't know the world as much as we do. We didn't have the internet. The 80s, 70s, right? Those movies, if we wanted to show the life of a prostitute, most people can't relate to that. So we have to show love interest. We've got to show getting what they want, etc., etc., so that they can accept and root for this person and then explore their world together. Brokeback Mountain, 1981, would not have been as successful. A lot of people don't have that same lifestyle. They don't have that same experience. So we'd really, really have to focus on that first act. Making that a second act, starting in the second act, people would reject it. Today, however, with the internet and with how open society is and how we are okay and comfortable just getting sucked into a movie, we're allowing ourselves to suspend our morality that we have for the world in order to engage and enjoy a story. We're starting to see that works a little bit better. So films like Whiplash, films like Ex Machina, Master and Commander are really good examples of 2-act structures that are on long-form films that are features. All right, so hopefully through that process, you learned a lot about how the structure of films work, especially 3-act structures, and the 6 most important parts throughout that the Hexodus. We also looked at how the Hexodus can be broken down into a 2-act structure and how that still works within our stories. We looked at the major questions that are involved and how to keep our interest or our audience's interest in our films. And this now gives us a really good starting point about what to look for as we're looking at our films and ways that we can talk about our films and just a kind of a starting point to start even to think about how to write our films. So I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to discuss it amongst yourselves, share the ideas of this, and get ready to use it. And I look forward to seeing you in class. Bye, Bamel.